I don't think there's such a thing as a pure culture of a bacterium. I think what happens is that there's so much swapping, sharing of genes, that in a colony that grows on an agar plate, within that colony, there are some of the cells that carry, let's say, mercury resistance genes, coding for mercury resistance, but not the entire population. And so when the organism comes up against an environment that's mercury rich, then there's a kind of social behavior where they toss genes to each other so that they can metabolize the mercury. And so we get what's called adaptation, where it's really gene sharing to meet up against the environmental pressure of having to exist and function in an environment that has a lot of mercury in it. There's this kind of constant shifting and sharing.
Welcome to This View of Life, where we take a deep dive with the best and brightest thinkers on anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. I am your host, David Sloan Wilson. For more interviews, articles, videos, and special publications, search for This View of Life on your favorite search engine. Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for This View of Life, and I am so happy to be interviewing Rita Colwell today. Hello, Rita.
Hello, good to talk with you, David.
Thank you. You are a distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland and at the John Hopkins School of Public Health, and you have just written a book titled A Lab of One's Own, One Woman's Personal Journey Through Sexism in Science. And full disclosure, you're also about to join the board of Pro-Social World, the spin-off of the Evolution Institute that I'm so excited to be launching upon with your help. And I am titling this podcast, A Tale of Two Evolutionary Processes. The first one, of course, is genetic evolution, and you know all about that as a microbial ecologist. The second is... Indeed, yes, as we will see. And the second is cultural evolution, because cultural change is an evolutionary process. People use the words evolution and adapt all the time, but so often they don't think about consulting the actual science of change, evolutionary science, when they think about cultural change. They do so all the time for genetic change, seldom for cultural change, and that's what the Evolution Institute and Pro-Social World are all about, to think more explicitly about cultural change from an evolutionary perspective than was possible in the past. And I think that there's so many different ways to come upon this, Rita. One thing we're going to be talking about is sexism and how slow that is to change. But we're also going to talk about medical wisdom and how slow that is to change. Attitudes about evolution, how slow that is to change. And so we're talking about all forms of cultural change. Why is it that they're often so slow or don't take place at all, or take place in pathological directions rather than positive directions? And what can be done about that? So cultural change in general, cultural change is fast compared to genetic change, actually with a lot of overlap, because as you know, some genetic change is fast and some cultural change is slow. So on the bell curve of rates of change, genetic and cultural evolution actually partially overlap each other. And what we need to do in a policy sense often is slow down the process of genetic evolution for microbes and speed up the process of cultural evolution for what we do about microbes. So I wanted to begin, as you do in your book, with your childhood and your family being Italians immigrating to the U.S. And not many current listeners are going to remember a time in which Italians were discriminated against, much like African Americans always have been. And if you could just say a little bit about that, especially the warm greeting that your father had when he bought the house in a kind of, for him, an upscale neighborhood, the warm welcome wagon that was awaiting him when.
Yes, it is really unusual to, to live through the last 60 or 70 years, because now Tony Fauci is a national hero. Tony grew up in a very similar background as I, perhaps even more discriminatory because he grew up in New York City. My father deliberately chose to settle in rural New England, where he worked as a laborer to start, eventually forming his own construction company. But as a child, being of Italian descent was really not accepted. In fact, my father was determined to move from what you might call a ghetto. It wasn't much of a ghetto. It was just a collection of families, Italian families on the other side of the railroad track. But he was determined to have children with access to a very good school. So he bought a house. And can you imagine? This is during the Depression. He saved $3,000 cash, very diligently, collecting the money, saving it, and then depositing it as a complete sale for a house in Beverly Cove, Massachusetts, just a block from the lighthouse in Beverly. And no sooner had the family moved in, this was before I was born, so I'm just telling you what I have been told, this family lore. But a knock at the door, and there's a councilman saying to my father that he had learned that it just moved in, and the neighbors had collected money and were willing to pay him back the down payment of the house if they would just move away. And my father said, "I'm sorry, but I paid for this
I
house.
own
It's
this
paid
house.
for. I own the house." And he closed the door, and that was that.
Yeah, and then I mean, so
So
we have to look back to a time in which there was discrimination against Italians, Southern Europeans of all stripes, Catholics, Jews, of course, and it was a Protestant world. Basically, it was a Protestant white world. And Peter Turchin, my colleague Peter Turchin, in his book Ages of Discord, provides an amazing analysis of this dynamic as competition among elites. When we think of competition, and we think of course, the lower classes being disturbed by society, but most of the action, or much of the action, according to Peter, takes place among the elites, of course. And when there's an overproduction of elites, more people expecting a lavish lifestyle than there are opportunities, they compete with each other and they seek to exclude each other. And there you get a dynamic of, for example, Protestant elites seeking to exclude the competition, which are Catholics and Jews, also capable of existing in the elite class. And so this is actually an example of cultural evolutionary thinking that everyone needs to read about. They need to read Peter's book after they read your book. Now, one thing that you do throughout your book, which I love, is you're very even-handed, and you're acknowledging in all aspects of your life open, warm-hearted, accepting people, in addition to closed-minded, prejudiced people. And so on the one hand, you had parents of your schoolmates who wouldn't let you play with them, wouldn't let you into their house. And on the other hand, you had adults who welcomed you into your home and served as nurturers, basically. And then also I want to comment that despite this neighborhood that didn't want you there, this was a time in American history where a small child could go outdoors and roam around as freely as they liked, without feeling in danger. And so help me understand how on the one hand, this was an area of prejudice, and on the other hand, an area of freedom as far as a child navigating their environment. And here I'm touching upon the work of Peter Gray that a lot of our readers my listeners will know, who champions this form of unstructured play. So tell us a little bit about those aspects of your childhood.
When I think about it, I was really, really very fortunate because we literally had the entire range of the neighborhood. And when I think about it now, in the summer, we'd get up, do our chores, pack a lunch, and be gone for the day. Go to the beach, go swimming, go to the playground, uh, go to the local park, hike around the woods, come back home for dinner. That was the rule. You had to be home in time for dinner. But the whole day was spent really doing the things you wanted to do. And in the evenings in the summer, thinking back, the kids in the neighborhood would gather in the street and play kick the can. You know, it would be dusk, and you kick the can and you go and hide, and then you get found. You come back, and the game would play until it was bedtime, and then your parents would come out and say, "Time to go to bed." And when I think about it, today, children are not allowed to that kind of freedom. I can remember going to the movies. If I did some babysitting and had enough money, my friends and I would just go off to the Saturday matinee. We'd just say, off to the movies, off we'd go and come back. It was an amazing time in retrospect. The other aspect of it that I think is quite amusing in thinking back is that my father loved to garden. So he grew everything, all the vegetables, flowers, raised chickens, rabbits. So that we had the kind of diet that people pay a lot of money for.
Yeah.
But that was part of growing up.
Yeah, no, that is so telling for all of this. Does this mean that the children were more accepting than the adults in terms of your playmates? Were you bullied? Were children exhibiting the prejudice of their parents?
Oh, they were. They were. It depended. The only person that I remember exhibiting genuine prejudice, but still was a playmate, was the daughter of the local doctor. There, it was clear that I was in a different stratum, so to speak. But nevertheless, we were playmates because we all went to the same little 4-room schoolhouse that housed 6 grades. Didn't have kindergarten in those days, or at least I wasn't part of kindergarten. But there was grades 1 to 6 in a 4-room schoolhouse with grades 1 and 2 split between the second grade split between the first and third grade, and then the 4th grade split between the 5th and 6th. It was interesting because going through school for the first 6 years with the same playmates, same neighbors, I think has a kind of consolidating and a kind of, I think, safety aspect to it. It's kind of a cocoon.
Yeah, a cocoon in a good sense. And this is very much in the spirit of pro-social, trying to recreate this. I mean, in so many ways, when we try to evolve the future, as I like to put it, then it involves going back to those times in some respects, of course, but not others. It's not as if the past was wonderful. And no, we have to be much smarter than that. But there's something about small, stable communities, for heaven's sakes, safe places where children can go, don't need helicopter moms or dads, can just go out. The importance of play, mixed age play. This is Peter. I'm channeling Peter Gray here. Children learning from other children. That's how cultural transmission takes place in all indigenous culture, which has been severed in modern life, and so on and so forth. Now, unsurprisingly, despite your wonderful family, sexism was bred into the bone of Italian culture at that time, just as most other cultures. And I was so, for example, sons were treated different than daughters. I mean, it was just went without saying that that sons had privileges, daughters were expected to help out with the housework. Just tell us a little bit about this kind of bred in the bone sexism in your own Italian heritage.
Well, I think my father was a bit unusual in that we children did what was customarily expected of us. The boys would help my father chop the wood in the winter for the coal stove or the wood burning stove, or help load up the coal when the coal man came to deliver the coal, because we had a coal furnace, and also to help feed the chickens and that sort of thing. And we girls were expected to help with the housework. And I was not very good at sewing, so I was not asked to help much there. um, we didn't really help cooking. My mother and father really did that. My father, I think, to escape having to go to church on Sunday, would cook the Sunday dinner. But my mother and father really were a team in preparing meals. But I think my father was very much more liberal in the sense that he strongly believed in education. And it didn't matter at all to him whether you were a girl or a boy. It was a matter of a very, very good education, strong, solid education. So whatever it took to be educated, that was fine. If they had to work harder for uniforms or whatever, they would make that sacrifice. Fortunately, the school that we attended was a public school, the elementary and grade school. And similarly, my parents chose not to send us to Catholic school. In retrospect, I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
My father really chose to send us to the public school. And I don't think it was a matter of not wanting to spend. I think he just wanted that liberal general education, public education, just thinking in retrospect.
Yeah. Well, let's fast forward to your early career and in marine microbiology. We don't have to go fast. I want all salient aspects. Of course, you chose a academic life for yourself, and then as you tell the story, ending up as a marine microbiologist was almost like a ball in a pinball machine, trying this and that, finding some doors open, some doors closed, and at that point, I think I have it correctly that marine microbiology, you might say, was a backwater subject or just some kind of little niche subject that, before you thought you might be, a doctor, a medical microbiologist or something like that. But those doors were closed. So let's cover that aspect of your career, and then we can get to your first great achievement having to do with Vibrio cholera.
Well, actually, you're quite right in saying that there were many opportunities and many people who were supportive. As an undergraduate at Purdue University, and by the way, going to Purdue was an adventure in itself, in that I was accepted at Radcliffe and several other colleges in New England. But the tuition was high. It's ridiculous when you think about it now. Tuition was something like $2,000 a year,
right?
Instead of
70,000 or 40 or whatever.
Yeah, but it might as well have been a king's ransom, because that was a lot of money. If I had gone to Radcliffe, which was the women's college, men only men could go to Harvard,
right,
or Princeton, or the Ivies in those days. So if I went to Radcliffe, which was the women's college of Harvard, I couldn't really use the library. Most of the buildings were not open to women. But worse, I would have had to commute because I would have to scrape together the tuition. And my sister had married a Dutch physicist who was on a Fulbright to the U.S., and she was teaching at Purdue, where he was a Fulbright fellow in physics. And she just sort of offhandedly suggested that I apply to Purdue. Now, I didn't know what Purdue was or anything except just another university. So I applied and received a complete scholarship. I wouldn't have to pay tuition. I would get my books provided. I would even have everything, including the dormitory, paid for. So I went off to Purdue and did very well, and was accepted. When I think about it now, it's kind of interesting. I was accepted to every medical school I applied to. And now I just assumed that was normal. But really, in 1956, only 5% of all medical schools, maximum, were women. So I didn't know it at the time, but I was lucky in that I was accepted at very good medical schools, including Yale. And I was off to medical school, but my senior year, in March of my senior year, I went out on a blind date with a handsome graduate student who was a friend of my colleague in my biochemistry class, who had asked my boyfriend in the biochemistry class if he could have permission to take me on this quote date, because he had been asked to chaperone, because in those days fraternities had to have a chaperone.
Oh, those quaint times.
Quaint times. And women, of course, had hours that you had to be in the dorm by 10 o'clock. Of course, that's all gone. So I went out with Jack to this roller skating party, and that was fate, because we discovered that we had a very strong attraction for each other, and we were married 2 months later. And so that's what led me to this strange situation where I went to the department chair thinking, if you're a straight A student, you could get a fellowship, because they had several, and I knew that there were some open. So I asked the chairman if I could apply for a fellowship. And he said, quite bluntly, he said, we don't waste fellowships on women. The notion being that if you educated a woman, she'd get married, have children, and be gone. Well,
right.
As it turns out, that's not always the case. In fact, I don't think it's ever the case for someone genuinely interested in science. So that was the first change in my career. But being very upset, I went to see my undergraduate advisor. And again, that's something interesting, because in those days, you had to see your undergraduate advisor. It wasn't like today, you're assigned to him or her, a faculty member. And if you choose to go talk with them, fine. If you don't, fine.
Yeah.
But in those days, you had to go every semester in chit chat. So I'd gotten to know my undergraduate advisor. And I went to talk to him, and he knew that I was an A student. And he happened to have a slot for a research assistant on a grant that he had just gotten to study genetics. So that's how I did a master's in genetics, working with my undergraduate advisor.
Of course, and that put you in the right place in the right time, because this was just the ground floor for molecular biology and genetics, genome sequencing, and all of that, which has gone so many light years ahead. Back then was just starting, just starting. And again, we have this combination of open and closed doors. I want to learn a little bit more about Jack, because he seems to be exceptionally ahead of his time in terms of in terms of honoring your career wishes and so on. Could you tell us just a little bit more about how that how were you so lucky as to find such a open-minded and person in the form of Jack?
When I think about it, I was extraordinarily blessed. Jack, I miss him terribly. We were married for 62 years when he passed away from prostate cancer 2 years ago. He was amazing, just amazing in retrospect. The thing is, I knew it was going to be a good marriage because we did not disagree on anything serious. When it came to education, we both wanted to get advanced degrees. Still wanted to get my MD, and he was going to get his PhD. He came from a working class family. His next oldest brother had gotten a PhD, was the first in the family. I think not to go to college, but to go on to graduate school. And he'd done his PhD, his brother Chuck, at Purdue. Jack had worked his way through Mount Union College in Ohio, a small 4-year college. And then both his chemistry professor, Jack Coots, and his older brother, Chuck, had gone to Purdue. So that's how he ended up at Purdue. We both liked sports. We played tennis together. He was a champion golfer. He had won the Ohio Conference Championship. And funnily enough, when we were at a meeting in Switzerland with Senator Lugar from Indiana, he and Jack got chatting. They discovered they had played against each other in golf.
Oh.
And of course, Jack had beat him, but Jack was very polite and didn't remind him of that. Jack was intellectual in his own way. It's interesting. He wasn't ambitious in the sense of wanting to become president of this or that or the other. He simply loved to learn. And he was very tolerant of the fact that I was always trying to get the chip off my shoulder, and therefore willing to go into any competition. And I wasn't going to come out of any competition without winning. Didn't mind that as long as I didn't make him do the same thing. So he did what he liked to do. He loved physics. Physical chemistry is what he started out doing, but soon became a physicist, low temperature. We never argued about how to raise the children. He was very much involved. He adored the children. In fact, when we were postdocs, and our first child, Allison, was 3 months old, I was invited to give a paper at the American Society for Microbiology and told Jack that I'd have to go for a week. He said, fine. He said, I'll manage. So I went off for a week. Now, this was 1964.
Yeah, early on.
Way early. And so I went off to the meeting for a week and then came back. Of course, we had help. We had someone coming in during the day, so it wasn't as if he had to stay home from work. But the helper came in at 9 and left at 5. So he was left with a 3-month-old baby from 5 in the afternoon until 9 o'clock the next morning.
Right.
So that's heroism in those days.
Yeah. I mean, that's heroism in these days too. But I mean, if more people are doing it, but still, this is back to the slow pace of cultural change. We kind of say, oh my heavens, here we are decades later, and it's still the case that there's an imbalance between the what couples do, so on, so on and so forth. So cultural evolution is a slow process with respect to that, along with so much more. Well, I want to hop now, Rita, to what you accomplished with the study of the cholera bacteria, Vibrio cholera. And if I could set the stage for it, as I understand it from your book, at the time, they thought that this was a disease that gets transmitted from human to human. That's all there is to it. And what you uncovered was a very complex ecology, that this bacteria lives outside of humans. It lives in a marine ecosystem. It actually digests chitin, of all things, inhabits copepods, minute crustaceans. By the way, I started my career on copepods. I was an aquatic ecologist starting out, and my first scientific publication was on food size selection in copepods. So, and
That's terrific.
I also studied vertical migration in copepods. So basically, this is paradigmatic to think of a disease as an organism that inhabits a natural environment, and then almost coincidentally, you might say, lands in humans. And so today that might be more mainstream, but not at the time. And so tell us a little bit about the encounters that you established, which would be sexism plus more. If you were a male, you would have encountered many of the same barriers. And we know from the annals of medical history that so many examples, starting with germ theory, of innovations that took just so long. I mean, generations were required to do something which makes so much sense, saves so many lives, but nevertheless, changing the establishment wisdom is extraordinarily hard to do, even when it actually needs to be done. So there's my intro to what anything you want to say.
Well, your reference to changing customs reminds me of the story of Semmelweis, a physician who believed in the germ theory and felt that women were dying from puerperal fever because they were being infected by the gynecologists, the physicians, who never bothered to wash their hands because they didn't really understand germ theory. And he sort of introduced the hand washing and disinfectant, and was actually literally driven mad, ended up in an insane asylum and dying because he was ostracized for having the audacity to blame physicians for transmitting the infection. Yeah. So you're right, there's a long history. In my case, physicians studying cholera, which is a pandemic organism, it has caused pandemics going back to historical records in time, to ancient Egyptians. So the notion that the disease could be caused by an environmental microorganism simply wasn't acceptable. Now today, it's interesting. Today, emerging infectious disease, including COVID-19, comes from the environment, comes from bats, comes from the natural system. Yeah. So from my work as a marine microbiologist, I studied a group of bacteria called Vibrios, short, curved, microscopic, rod-shaped bacteria, sort of like a little sausage, if you will, with a tail. Can be seen only under the microscope with magnification of over 1,000 times. So being a microbiologist, having studied marine organisms and having isolated so many species of Vibrios from the aquatic system, in order to classify the microorganisms that I was isolating, I had to use the type species. The type species is the one that was first described and is in the culture collection, the American Type Culture Collection. and labeled as a Vibrio. And that type species was Vibrio cholerae. So I obtained strains of Vibrio cholerae, and to my surprise, it behaved exactly like all the other Vibrios that I had been studying. So I did the traditional test for aquatic bacteria,
This,
namely,
Rita, let me cut in here because this was the days before the genetic revolution, and so when people studied microbes, what they did was that they'd culture them under various conditions, right? And they'd see if they would grow and so on. So it was from today's standpoint, a little bit primitive. You just can't get a DNA sequence or anything like that. You would be culturing them under different media and so on and so forth, and then classifying them. Also, their morphology, whether their colonies were, what color and shape their colonies were, and is that right? Is that you want to elaborate on just the?
Absolutely, because that led to another early adopter that I am. In the case of bacteriology, as it was called, instead of just microbiology encompassing viruses and fungus and so forth, studying bacteriology, the only thing you could really do in the 50s and 60s, and even into the early 70s, was to grow them in the laboratory. And if you couldn't grow them in the laboratory, they weren't considered alive, which is quite amusing now.
Yeah, that would be 98% of all microbes or something.
Exactly. And so the idea, first of all, that this bacterium that caused millions and millions of people to die from the disease it caused to be naturally occurring in the environment was really anathema to the medical community. And so there was a tremendous pushback that this could not be possibly derived from the environment, to the point that it was really an argument. It sounds so silly now. It was a big argument at meetings. Scientists, microbiologists arguing that the Vibrios from the environment were a Vibrio cholerae from the environment were a different species from the Vibrio cholerae that infected humans.
Right.
That's how absurd the argument was. And it was because I had studied genetics and I was the world was moving into molecular genetics just at the time that this species argument was raging. And this was at a time, this would have been about 1975, 1978, when we were extracting DNA, and the technique was so primitive. You heated the DNA so that the strands would separate. And so we would take a strain that had been grown in radioactive nutrients, so the DNA was radioactively labeled, and the same, let's say the Vibrio cholerae from a patient would be grown in a regular medium. And then we would mix these together. The DNA extracted from each together, we would heat it so that the strands would separate, and then we would cool it, and they would, quote, reanneal. They would find themselves, the strands. And then we would do this very elaborate centrifugation where we could separate by just weight. It was called a density gradient centrifugation. And you'd get the separation of unlabeled band, label band, and then a hybrid semi-label. And that's how we proved by this tedious technique that these species was the same, whether it came from the environment or humans.
But Rita, it seems to me that's not so implausible that you could imagine that there's the species that lives in the environment, and that, but because of local adaptation, basically, that species, yes, it starts to inhabit the gut, then local evolution takes place. And you don't call it a new species necessarily, but it is a new strain, it's a new something. So that argument isn't so far-fetched, is it?
It's not so far-fetched because it turns out that one of the discoveries we made as we sequenced lots and lots of embryos when we had the ability to do it very rapidly is that the genes are laterally transferred.
Right.
In the Vibrio, it's very promiscuous. It shares up to 80% of its genes, not all at once, but of the whole complement of the 3 or 4 million genes that it has, it can share 80% of them. So that's how they can recombine in the environment and indeed be selected to adapt, let's say, to a heavy metal rich soil or to a water system that has a lot of nutrients or not very much nutrients. So they have to perhaps fix nitrogen. We found some nitrogen fixing vibrios. So you're quite right. Adaptation, evolution.
And in
Indeed.
this case, horizontal transfer. So the whole concept of species goes completely messed up in terms of what a speed with that kind of swapping, gene swapping. Then these are profound issues, profound genetic evolution issues are being.
Well, let me push back a little bit because one of the things I did for my PhD was I had gathered, as you pointed out, so much data on hundreds of strains and species of bacteria in order to identify them and to put all this jumble of data together. The University of Washington had a brand new computer, the IBM 650, which was the size of about 6 or 7 refrigerators linked together. And it had the computation capacity of what we now have in a watch.
A toaster,
but in any case, it allowed me, or a toaster, and it allowed me to sift through the data. And one of the things I tested was the ability, if there was so much genetic exchange, were species just kind of mixes and matches? Well, they're not really. There are genes that are housekeeping and fairly stable, and then there are genes that can be shifted.
Right. Yeah. Good. Thank you for that. That's a more accurate portrayal. So this new paradigm, basically a whole ecological and therefore evolutionary paradigm. If we're going to understand a disease, we have to understand how it operates in a much larger ecological context with rapid evolution in mind. Well, rapid and not so rapid. And one of the things that I have to confess feeling puzzled about to this day, I think about it a lot, is how, of course, microbial evolution is super fast, takes place in each and every host for disease organisms. But on the other hand, well, not really, because people talk about, strains, only a few of them, the evolution of a more virulent strain taking place, slowly, in some way that's different than the micro evolutionary changes that are indeed taking place at a very fast scale, and so on and so forth. And I don't know, maybe it's not the place of this conversation to dive into that particular subject, but how is it that virus evolution and microbial evolution can be not so fast in some respects as far as the evolution of important strains are concerned?
Well, I think you're allowing me to expound on another hypothesis of mine that I would dearly love to have the time to develop, and that is that I don't think there's such a thing as a pure culture of a bacterium. I think what happens is that there's so much swapping, sharing of genes, that in a colony that grows on an agar plate, that within that colony, there are some of the cells that carry, let's say, mercury resistance genes, coding for mercury resistance, but not the entire population. And so when the organism comes up against an environment that's mercury rich, then there's a kind of social behavior where they toss genes to each other so that they can metabolize the mercury. And so we get what's called adaptation, where it's really gene sharing to meet up against the environmental pressure of having to exist and function in an environment that has a lot of mercury in it. So
Oh,
I think there's this kind of constant shifting and sharing.
Rita, that is such a perfect segue to cultural evolution. So, and I have a painful confession to make to the world. I'm about to make it, so here it comes. Only now am I reading the classic work on the diffusion of innovations by that title, The Diffusion of Innovations by Everett M. Rogers, now in its 5th edition. Should be read by anyone interested in cultural change. That's the word, that's where the phrase early adopters comes from, that you used a little bit. It is
Ah,
a compendium of innovation studies dating back to the classic, which was the adoption of hybrid corn in Iowa. Such things as, family planning, how that spreads. It even mentions kindergarten. You mentioned before that in your childhood, kindergarten hadn't quite arrived yet. Well, that's right, because kindergarten was an idea that originated in Germany, as the name implies, and ultimately spread very widely. So now kindergartens are everywhere, but there's a history to that. And one of the take-home messages of this great compendium that everyone has read but me, or maybe you, maybe we have to make the same painful admission but I have no excuse because I study, and I've known about the book for forever, is precisely as you described for bacteria. If we think of the spread of innovation as just like individuals making their decisions as an individual process, absolutely not. Absolutely not. It is a social process, quite an elaborate social process that flows along lines of influence, so on and so forth. And there's many, many complications to that, which I think is where, and it's an interesting question to ask, given that this is a field of studies that's decades old, highly interdisciplinary, thousands of papers, what is the added value of approaching this venerable topic from an explicit evolutionary perspective? Well, what is the added value of that? And maybe you have something to say about that, but we'll address that as we continue our conversation.
I think this provides the segue to a topic that I did not start out to want to discuss and write about and become the spokesperson for, and that is misogyny and sexism, and the change that is slowly occurring. And again, it's individual men, like my husband, like my professor, John Liston, the department chairman, who wasn't exactly enlightened, but he was kind and supportive, George Chapman at Georgetown, and folks with whom I have subsequently worked, Neil Lane, who was the NSF director and became the science advisor when I became director of NSF. The men who, by quiet example, and either because they, like my husband, didn't really care what anybody thought, he just did what was right, and by others who just wanted to be kind and therefore did what was right, it seeds the cultural change that I think is occurring. And it has maybe what would be called punctuated evolution, where you have a cataclysmic shift, like the Nancy, the team at MIT, who went around and measured the labs of men that were clearly larger than the labs assigned to women, Nancy Hopkins at MIT. That was a scientific kind of a game changer temporarily, or at least the beginning of a game change. And then the Me Too movement, which is another tipping point. So does this kind of fit into your...
It does, Rita. And let me cover that in my own words, because I think that you're making points that I want to make, and it's a nice way to just, establish a common understanding between us. So we start at the individual level, people that are just wonderful people. They do the right things. They don't care what other people think. And so we have that level. And we could ask, if that's the only thing that happens, how long would that take to spread until everyone is like that? And the answer is a long, long time, maybe never. Okay, because you get the other ones, the obstinate ones that never want to change. That's the, funeral by funeral kind of change. So the individual level is important. You need to have that kind of variation. But it's not good enough as far as these changes that need to take place. And when you talk about what took place at MIT, we're introducing a very important institutional element to the story. And you start out with an individual, Nancy Hopkins, right? And so she is like incredible about actually proving sexism at MIT, even to the point of measuring with a tape measure the size of the labs and so on. So she builds this case, and then she takes it to who? The dean or basically a high up person at MIT, right? And then that person, luckily, is the kind of person who does the right thing, is a receptive person who understands that this is wrong, that something must be done about it, but then can bring the whole structure and power of the institution to bear upon it. So now it's no longer just a matter of what you choose to do or not do. Now there is something is kicking in at this point, institutionally mandated change that causes the whole thing to take place faster within the institution and to begin to serve as an exemplar to other institutions. Because now if MIT can do it, then maybe others would. And because MIT is a high prestige university, if it had been Slippery Rock Teachers College, it wouldn't have had the effect, with apologies to Slippery Rock, if it still exists. So now we have issues of prestige, institutions, and institutional norms, and the whole mechanisms of putting those into actions. And maybe you could just, carry the ball on that conversation. I'd be interested to know if MIT, which for a period was as an exemplar for this, it still is, or whether it actually relapsed in some sense. Is it still like a beacon for solving these problems?
It was fortuitous in that the president was very receptive, and the dean was key. Bob Birgeneau, the dean, in that he had the power, just as you described, to make the changes, to insist that committees have women faculty on it, that women candidates be brought in to be interviewed if they were qualified, equally qualified. And so there was an uptick that occurred, not so sharp, but an uptick that occurred in the hiring. And Chuck Vest, the president, is quoted rightfully as saying that, and I'm paraphrasing, that he had thought there was maybe some substance to the complaint, but when presented with the facts, realized there was, in fact, genuine data to show that it was real and not just hypothesized. So that combination kept the momentum. But then Bob went on to become president at University of California, Berkeley. And the subsequent dean continues somewhat, but today it's not that much greater percentage of women faculty. It still does not represent anywhere close to, let's even say 49% or 50%. It's something in the order of, I can't remember exactly, but somewhere in the range of 14 to 19%. So it hasn't really changed. So how do you maintain cultural change? That's what we're going through right now, because that took place long before the Me Too movement. And then there was this burst in the Me Too movement. And I'm hoping that by speaking out, I and many, many others, that we can sustain this continued change, at least combating overt sexism. Um, Sexism goes from what I call the criminal to the clueless. And the criminal you deal with in courts, not very well, but at least it's there. But it's the everyday inhibition of women in science, engineering, mathematics, technology, and medicine that I think we need to overcome.
Yeah, let me tell two stories. I'll try to be as short as I can that I think illustrates the added value of an explicit evolutionary perspective. And the first story is something that needs to be done again and again, which is to see how problems look when shrunk down to the scale of small groups, because the small group is the natural human social environment. So if you imagine the hunter-gatherer tribe, the village, the group of people that know each other well, that interact with each other all the time, how is it that they regulate themselves so well? Well, first of all, they pretty easily converge upon some norm, something that they all think should be done. That's shared. And then they have ways of monitoring it. They're all with each other all the time, so it's hard to do anything in secret. And so they monitor it. And then if somebody misbehaves, something is done about it. And typically, and this is relying upon the work of Eleanor Ostrom, need not start out harsh. And in everyday life, if somebody misbehaves, first thing that happens, gossip. Gossip is what happens. Talk erupts. And then that person is really eager to preserve their reputation. And so they really want to repair the damage just to stop the gossip, things like that. But on the other hand, if it's a real bad case, then there's ways to escalate, and ultimately exclusion is and it doesn't even end there. Richard Wrangham, the Harvard anthropologist, has a new book out called The Goodness Paradox, and it's all about self-domestication. That's a big buzzword now, is that we know about the way we domesticated our animals and plant companions. Well, do you know we domesticated ourselves the same way, and that was a genetic evolutionary process. And part of that was just flat out capital punishment. Throughout history, if there was somebody who just couldn't behave, couldn't help themselves, well, they were killed. That's what happened. And so that's one of the points of Wrangham's book. And then in addition to those negative sanctions, there's positive sanctions for those who behave well. The solid citizen is showered with praise and social benefits, and that's what the concept of a reputation is. And people in a well-functioning society, then people are just, they compete to have a good reputation. And the only way that they can do that is to do what's good for the group. So there you have a capsule description of what makes small groups function so well. And then the entire problem is to scale that up. How do we make that work at a larger scale? And sometimes it does, and those are the things that work well. When it doesn't, those are the things that work poorly. And so story number 2, if you don't mind me just blathering on for a couple more minutes, one of my favorite examples of how this was successfully scaled up, and it has to do with selling tobacco products to minors. So that's against the law, and the federal government actually monitors it. The appropriate agency employs underage people to go into convenience stores and try to buy tobacco products. And if they succeed above a certain rate, then the states are put on notice that they stand to lose millions of dollars in block grants if they don't bring the problem under control, if they don't comply with the law. So a degree of monitoring takes place. What takes place naturally in a small group actually has been scaled up through this process. So now we know when a convenience store or any outlet is misbehaving with respect to the law, it gets noticed. Then there's the question of what to do about it. And so that's where they went to my 2 colleagues, Tony Biglin and Dennis Embry, who are smart about these sorts of things. And here's what they did in 2 states. It was Wisconsin and Wyoming. In the first place, they mounted a publicity campaign so that the norm of you shouldn't sell tobacco products to minors, I mean, it's a law, but that doesn't mean that it's a salient norm. you actually have to bring it to the consciousness of people. And so they had local authorities, the mayor, the celebrities, and especially the owners of convenience stores, basically to get them on board that this is a norm that needs to be enforced. So that was the first thing they had to do. Just like in a small group takes place spontaneously, work was required to do this at the scale of a state. And then they employed their own underage agents to go in and try to buy tobacco products. And if they succeeded, then the convenience store clerk was given a mild reprimand, just a little sheet of paper that says, "Did you know that this is against the law? No more." And then, so there's your mild punishment. If they refused to sell tobacco products to the minors, they were showered with praise. They were written up in the local newspapers. They were given free meals at the local McDonald's and so on. Their name, their face was put on the wall. And then they had a contest to see, because it's a bit of a tight situation to refuse selling cigarettes to a minor who might be a very tough-looking person or gang of people. So they had a contest of what's the most snappy things that you could say when you refuse somebody. And they picked the snappiest things to say, and they wrote them up on little cards. So now all the convenience store owner had to, a clerk had to do was to hand the card to the person. And in this fashion, and basically establish the norm, monitor, mild punishment, abundant praise. They scaled all of that up. And do you know they brought the problem under control in 60 days? 60 days. That's lightning fast for cultural evolution. And so now when we turn that to a much larger problem, such as sexism in institutions, that's what we have to do, something like that. And at the end of your book, you actually point to that as one of your many recommendations. You say, if we had, first of all, and the Me Too movement is like establishing the norm better than ever before. So it's more widely accepted now that this is flat out wrong. If you disobey this, you don't deserve to have your job. And maybe you even deserve to go to jail if you violate this norm. So that's point one. But we need more. We need monitoring. And one of the recommendations that you make is that universities should post statistics on all of these things. And among other things, what that means is that anybody who wants to go to a college or a university that does this well, as opposed to one that does that poorly, that information will be made available. And so now your brightest women, let us say, are going to go to the institutions that have a proven reputation for actually walking the walk. And that information is available. And then you have, mild sanctions and all of that. You can see that operation. You could construct it. You could scale it up so that it takes place. And then the cultural evolution would take place faster than, it ever would otherwise, but only if you scale up what takes place naturally at a small scale. And we could repeat that exercise for each and every social problem that we have. Okay, end of my rant.
It's very interesting because what it says is that the initial efforts were really to use the law and force Title IX, which
was huge,
as you say, is huge, and it set the standard. But then it has taken time for it to be embedded and incorporated, and it might have been done faster if we had been positive in the reinforcement. Very interesting.
This might be the last point we cover, Rita, because we've covered so much ground. But one can't help but notice reading your book. Oh, there's this whole piece. There's two more things to cover. I'm sorry. I hope you have the time. One is the anthrax letters. And
yes.
And so this is a whole story of your life, in which you basically brought the new genetic technology to bear so that you could trace this anthrax in the letters to a single lab, even a single flask, as far as I remember, to really pinpoint. So this is a great scientific a detective story. But in addition to that, you comment that because it was such a dire emergency, and we're so submerged in emergencies now, we don't remember the time when, just after 9/11, these letters started to appear and nobody knew what it was. Was it Al-Qaeda? What was it? And this amazing initiative that actually answered that question, that because it was such an emergency, there was very little sexism on display. People actually operated as a team, and the men, women, that was just like, who cares about that? So this is another reason that we could understand that when the stakes are really high, then these other differences, which are like recalcitrant, when the stakes are lower, then the system becomes more responsive when the stakes are higher, almost spontaneously. Nobody had to even talk about it. It was just like, we got to cooperate, right?
Yes. Well, it wasn't that you have to cooperate. It's just that we wanted to cooperate. It was a national emergency, and there was a coming together. The leadership, interestingly, this was under the Republican administration of George Bush, uh, the Bush 2, where everybody focused on addressing the threat to all of civilization, so to speak. And it was a fascinating time when we got together. I knew exactly what we had to do because having studied strain variation, speciation, I knew probably better than anybody at the particular time, especially being director of NSF and having the ability to bring the team together. I knew exactly what had to be done. It wasn't as if we were thrashing around trying to figure out. I knew that if we didn't sequence straight away, there would be variations. And then who would know how we could settle this in court? Does this colony look a little different from this other colony on agar plates or whatever? So it came down to having to do this quickly, do it accurately. And remember, this was when sequencing was just in its infancy. We had maybe 3 or 4 totally sequenced, tiny, short DNA molecule bacteria, and only a partial sequence of anthrax, Bacillus anthracis. So we were literally building that airplane as we were flying it.
Yeah, that's so amazing. And so 2 more points to cover. I keep saying that, but one is your administrative abilities, Rita. But you're former director of NSF, but you have so many other administrative posts in your life, which I guess continues to a degree. You're such a kind of a systemic person, how you go about things. And of course, to talk about administration and programs like this is a very managed form of cultural evolution. And it should be thought of that way. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts of how you were able to function in often several at once administrative capacities at the same time that you were managing a very, very active scientific career and having a family life and going sailing with your husband. I mean, everyone should want to learn from how you were able to do so much through these varying capacities, including these administrative capacities.
I really loved what I was doing. I love science, and I like being able to help people to improve the lot of everybody. So I think it was always, I never had difficulty getting up in the morning. It always struck me that sunset came too soon, and I had just gotten started. So it was a genuine interest in what I was doing, and a sense of what I was doing had meaning. And I think that's an important driver. And then as we've said already, having a completely supportive husband. I think if I had had turmoil, domestic turmoil, I could not have done this as much. And I had two really, really wonderful children, two daughters. One is a physician and runs a clinic, a pediatrician and palliative care clinic. And the other is a botanist. She's now at the University of California, Davis, and she's in charge of the herbarium. She's become an expert on identifying wildflowers, and she's an evolutionary biologist.
Awesome.
Yes. And interestingly, I give my husband credit because he loved trees and he loved vegetation. And Allison tells, my oldest daughter, tells the story that he had come home with a book on trees and he had said to Allison, come with me, we have to learn how to identify trees. Now, I think she was probably 5 years old, but again, a very strong influence of a parental pair who cared a lot about their children. I think it was also the fact that I had respite in recreation with my family. Sailing, I loved sailing. Jack loved racing. That was okay. It got me sailing. And if I had to race, that was fine. And I would do my best because we both liked to win regattas. He was a tactician and he loved to figure out how to get the best out of wind. In fact, he became known as the magician amongst the sailors because he could get the most out of every gust of wind. So I think it was being fortunate in having perhaps a holistic life that was rich in human interaction and values, intellectual in having a tremendous interest, shared with my husband who loved astronomy and read about it. And we have, our house is full of books. Neither of us could ever part with a book. So we have all racks and racks of books. So I think it was, looking back, it was really a happy time. Very fortunate.
That's perfect, Rita. And I'd like to expand upon it in the following way. On the one hand, we need to have the global good in mind because it's a global world. It'll never be different. But on the other hand, if you don't have a locally nurturing environment, then that is just as necessary. So there's a sense in which everything we do has to be with the global good in mind, but what I call the cellular level of society, the cells being not the individuals, but the small nurturing groups, which includes families plus more, the neighborhood, whatever business you're in, whenever you're working with other people to get things done at that scale, the functionally oriented group, that must be functioning well as well. Otherwise, you can't sustain the larger scale stuff. And then every intermediate level, every institution, social whatever, tradition, culture, ethnicity, whatever it is that defines who you are at this moment, and the middle range of institutions and so on and so forth, that has to be brought into alignment also. So this has to be a multi-level process, and arguably the two most important levels, they're all important, but arguably the two most important levels are, first of all, the global level, because if we don't pay that attention, then we'll do harm, basically, somewhere in the system. And the local level, because that's where we're built and designed to function in small, nurturing, trustworthy, trusting, highly cooperative groups. So that's the concept of multicellular society, borrowing again from biology, that we have to construct. And it has to be a mindful process. Cultural evolution, if it's not mindful, will take us where we don't want to go. It will be the problem, not the solution. And so I think that this idea of a tale of two evolutionary processes, genetic evolution and cultural evolution, and the need to think about cultural evolution with the same paradigm, as genetic evolution is certainly what I'm about, and what I was so honored to engage you with your involvement with Pro-Social World.
It's been really fun, David, really enjoyable.
Thanks for listening to This View of Life. If you like this podcast, you can subscribe in iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please consider rating it on iTunes and leaving a review to help others find the show. This View of Life is produced by the Evolution Institute, a nonprofit think tank whose mission is to provide science-based solutions for today's most pressing social issues in order to improve the quality of life. Learn more at evolution-institute.org. And if this view of life is important to you, then type TVOL 1000, TVOL 1000, to see how you can join the Darwinian Revolution.